Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Very warm welcome, Minister.
So, I'm sorry, Bronwyn, there's some technical difficulties on the audio side of things, so they're just restarting that.
Okay.
As soon as we may need to do the intro over again.
And everyone's patience. I'm going to wait. Shall I wait before introducing Simon Smith?
If you can, yeah.
You can get someone else to do the introduction.
Whole thing. Everyone, a second very warm welcome. Thank you for your patience. We now have the sound working with Kyiv, I'm delighted to say. So, warm welcome to this discussion of Russia's aggression and the crisis for multilateralism, and to this conversation with Dmytro Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. I'm Bronwyn Maddox, Director of Chatham House. Very brief housekeeping arrangements. This is being live streamed. It is being recorded. It is on the record. And please do tweet and promote this. Minister, very warm welcome to you. Let me give the briefest of introductions. Very, very glad to have you. I think everyone here, though, knows your record. You are a Ukrainian politician, diplomat, commentator at age 38. Mr. Kuleba was named Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs 3 years ago, making him the youngest ever foreign minister of Ukraine. And he began working in diplomacy in 2003, transitioned to the private sector a decade later, but after Russia's aggression against Ukraine in June 2014, went back into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has been working there since, as we know. I'm going to introduce as well Simon Smith, who's joined us, who's head of our chair of our Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House, forum set up in 2015 as a response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. And he had, before that, a 35-year career in the UK diplomatic service, including, crucially for this, ambassador to Ukraine at the point of that aggression from 2012 to 15, but also most recently ambassador to South Korea. Very warm welcome. And Minister, very warm welcome to you too. Minister, I want to start.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Then I'm listening.
Good. Let us start with Russia's presidency of the UN Security Council, about to begin in 2 days' time. Despite its violation of the UN Charter, despite ignoring all the United Nations General Assembly resolutions about the invasion, what are the implications of this presidency, and how should other countries respond to it?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing all of us together. And we have a very capable audience here in Kiev. These are young students of international relations and international law, of basically everything international. So for them, it will be a very important moment to follow our discussion and to pick it up in their future diplomatic endeavors. The presidency of Russia in the UN Security Council begins on the 1st of April. And frankly speaking, you cannot imagine a worse joke for April Fool's Day. It's the worst joke ever, that the country who systemically violated all fundamental rules of international security is presiding over a body whose only mission is to safeguard and protect international security. I don't think Russia will be able to change the balance inside of the UN Security Council during its presidency. It will try to abuse its rights of the presidency to push for its own narratives. But I doubt they will be able to secure the sufficient number of votes to make the council adopt decisions on matters related specifically to Ukraine. However, this presidency is a stark reminder that something is wrong with the way international security architecture is functioning. If a country that has illegitimately acquired a seat of a permanent member of the UN Security Council is presiding over a body while conducting a large-scale act of aggression against another sovereign member and another founding member of the United Nations. So I think the best we can do is to take this month to actually highlight the problems that exist in multilateralism and the problems that Russia is exploiting for its own benefit.
Thank you for that. The other question I asked you was how you thought other countries should respond. And from your answer, I think you're saying that they should continue to be part of the Security Council. They should not protest. They should go along with that, but vote against or block what Russia is doing. Is that the message you would give to countries, for example, the UK?
You know, there is a very kind of peculiar body in international relations which is the United Nations as such. And inside of the United Nations, there is the most peculiar body of the entire world, which is the Security Council. And it has its own dynamics, it has its own rules, it has its own kind of balance of relationship. So, of course, I wish all other members withdrew from the room and let Russia preside over an empty room. But I doubt this is going to happen. So what I expect from current members of the UN Security Council, both permanent and non-permanent, is actually to corner Russia as much as they can within existing procedures and rules during its presidency, not to allow it to abuse the Security Council rules, and to continue pushing for pushing the narratives which tell the truth about this war and that Russia is conducting.
Thank you for that. I want to move on to a slightly different argument, which is the argument that you and the countries supporting Ukraine very vigorously want to make to the countries which have chosen not to, have been non-aligned, have chosen not to say that they support Ukraine. They might say, as many countries in the global south do, this is not our fight. This has nothing to do with us. Even, we think maybe both sides were complicit in this. And this is something that you hear, it was very audible at the Munich Security Forum, for example, but there are many other places. What is the argument you think needs to be made to them?
The point is very, very simple. Yes, this war is physically taking place in Europe, but the repercussions of this war are felt all over the world. And I must tell you that I've heard many voices saying that this is not our war in the beginning of the aggression, of the large-scale invasion. But after the food crisis broke out, and as a result of Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports, the number of these voices arguing that this is not their war has significantly lowered, because people across the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, they all felt the impact of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. be it with food security or food prices, or the shortage of food or energy prices. So this argument that this is not their war just doesn't doesn't stand the reality check. So we have to speak with those countries. And that's what we're doing. We have to identify what their arguments are, and what are their reasons for these arguments. And that's what President Zelensky is doing. He's talking with many leaders from all over the world, and we take every opportunity to reach out to them to get a better understanding of how, not only what their problems are, but also how we can help them to resolve these problems.
Very interesting. I think absolutely rightly put on the food security and the sense of national interest that has brought some countries more to Ukraine's point of view. The grain deal that was brokered by the UN was extended again this month, but only for 120 days. Is there any more sustainable solution inside?
Well, grain initiative brokered by UN Secretary General and President of Turkey is being used by Russia as a leverage. And this is what the whole cynicism of Russia's policy is. While they argue that they defend the voices of the countries who belong to the so-called global south, they simultaneously put the issue of food security at high risk by using the functioning of the grain initiative as a leverage against Ukraine. So this is the kind of the cynical element of Russia's foreign policy, when you claim that you support someone with one hand, but at the same create problems for the same actor with your other hand. The most sustainable solution for that issue is, of course, the end of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. We never had any problems with exports of our grain to the world market. In fact, when I did the African tour last year, in one of the countries, my colleague, a foreign minister, said, "Listen, it's only when the food crisis hit us that we realized how important Ukraine is for our own stability and security. And we never realized that before because everything worked just perfectly. It's only the Russian aggression that interrupted the chains of supply, the exports, and created all of these problems." So there is really no other sustainable way out but for Russia to end its invasion of Ukraine and for Ukraine to restore its full export capacity in grain and other agricultural products, which we are willing to do, of course.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you about the global north, if I can use that phrase, about one country in particular, and that's the United States. I'd like to ask you directly whether you feel that Ukraine can win this conflict without continued US support, and whether you're concerned that US support may not continue after the next presidential election.
Well, of course, as diplomats, we always have to be far-looking and looking over the horizon. But the reality of war teaches you that the longest strategy planning you can do is probably after lunchtime, if you're making your plans in the morning. The question, I think, should be put differently. Why would the United States abandon Ukraine? Why would they cease to support Ukraine? I don't see any good reason for that, because what is happening in Ukraine, it's not only about Ukraine, it's about the entire world order. If Russia is allowed to succeed here, then every other country in the world who is bloodthirsty and looking at its neighbor will receive a completely wrong message that, yes, it is difficult, it is painful to occupy your neighbor, to wage a war, but in the end you get away with it. So it's worth trying. And this is something that is very simple, but that will ruin the entire world and will turn everything into chaos. So from the strategic perspective, I think the support will continue. And we appreciate every piece of support that we receive from every country, most notably, of course, from the United States. But everyone should always remember one thing. None of our partners who are providing support now, including the United States, believed that Ukraine would survive the first week of the Russian full-scale invasion. So while we shouldn't underestimate the support that is coming, you shouldn't underestimate the capacity of Ukrainians to fight either.
Thank you. Let me ask you one more thing before I come to Simon Smith, and this is about tribunals. At some point, perhaps prosecuting Russia for its crimes of aggression. On March the 4th last year, you spoke here with Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the UK, about the need for special tribunals. Where has that got to, in your view, and what needs to be done in order to make those work at some point in the future?
Well, the first time we raised the issue of the tribunal, the response coming from our closest friends was rather skeptical, to say the least. Now there is a growing consensus that there must be a tribunal, and the issue that we're discussing now is what will be the format of that tribunal. And this is the progress that we have made in something about a year, which is good dynamics given the complexity of the issue at the table. I'm confident that there will be a tribunal. I'm not ready to say in which format it will exactly take, what will be the exact format of that tribunal, but the purpose, we should be guided by the purpose, not by the form. And the purpose is to put President Putin and his closest entourage, including Foreign Minister Lavrov, at trial for the crime of aggression. It's a complicated task. It's not easy there are hundreds of legal questions that need to be answered, but we have to do it not only for Ukraine, but for the entire world, because this will be the best way, one of the best ways to prevent further aggressions. So other leaders and other politicians will think twice, if not three times, before pushing the button of aggression. It must be done. It's really, if every time anyone says the word, says about fighting impunity in the world, the first test that this narrative and this rhetoric has to pass is actually, are you able to prevent impunity in the case of the Russian aggression against Ukraine? Because if the answer to that question is negative, then answers to all other questions will be negative too. And that's not something that we should allow to happen.
Thank you very much for putting it so eloquently. Simon Smith, can I bring you in at this point? I love your comments on what the Minister has said, and particularly perhaps starting with this point about taking the argument to those countries that have remained non-aligned.
Yes, I think it's been a frustration for a lot of us who have supported Ukraine to see that, we've had several UN General Assembly votes with pretty resounding statements of condemnation for Russia's aggression, a pretty clear position taken that what Russia is doing is in gross violation of the UN Charter and so on, and yet those 140 plus votes have not really been converted into successful action in very many parts of the global south to widen the coalition of support for Ukraine. and to ensure that the real kind of understanding of what is going on here is actually taking root firmly amongst a wider section of the global community. And I think that sometimes we can say, well, the UN General Assembly, what does it mean? These votes, they're meaningless, they mean nothing. Isn't the UN performing badly? And I think if we do that, we're making a really big mistake. If the UN is performing badly, it's not the UN's fault, it's our fault. It's for the member states of the European Union to make it, of the United Nations, sorry. It's for the member states of the United Nations
Chatham House audience, yeah.
to make it work.
Yeah.
And I think that there is something here in that we do, as the international community, need to make the international organizations themselves work objectively to come up with the more convincing evidence, the more hard-hitting arguments that will help convince others in the global community. You mentioned the grain deal. There are still countries who are saying, yes, of course we recognize, as Dmytro Kuleba has said, of course we recognize that we are suffering as a result of the war. Great, that's step one to get that understanding. But step two is to say, yes, and we also understand that the reason this is happening is because of Russia's aggression. It is not happening because there is a sort of two-sided conflict between two countries where there are rights and wrongs on both sides, etc. It's happening because of Russia's violation of the UN Charter, and if those violations cease, then the grain problem will cease to be a problem for the countries suffering food shortages immediately. And that's the understanding. I think we do need the help of internationalizations to push that through with the objective evidence. But that's, in a sense, the next stage we need to achieve of understanding how this conflict started and how relatively easily, if the decision is made to honour the UN Charter, how relatively easily it can be resolved.
Have the international institutions failed?
If they failed, I think some of them have failed. I think some of them are failing. But again, I've always been convinced that if they fail, that's our fault. We can make them work better. We are all members of these international organizations. We can give them the tasking. Just one example, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They've not done a bad job, in my view, so far in looking at this dire risk attendant on the nuclear power station in Zaporizhia. But it's inevitable that they need to tread a very careful line. Now, we need to do a lot more work for them to say, OK, here is more evidence. Here are the arguments that say the nuclear safety agreements that all of us as members of the IAEA sign up to are being grossly breached. Here's what needs to be done about it. And we need to do the work of recruiting other countries in the global community to say, yes, actually, we see this exactly the same way as you do. There is one violator here, and this needs to stop.
Let me ask you one final thing before coming back to the Minister. The Foreign Minister has called for Russia to be removed from the UN Security Council in an op-ed earlier this month. Not possible? Desirable?
It does seem to be something. I mean, this idea was around when I was serving in Ukraine 8 years ago. I spoke to a lot of people then, but it seemed that almost every time you referred this proposal back to a capital, people would say, whoa, hold on a minute, that's going too far, or once you open that box, you will open more boxes. What I sense, actually, is that there is a lot more serious talk about this, a lot more serious thought to say, actually, let's give this serious consideration. I'm not convinced that I'm not convinced you would succeed in finding a way of doing this. I'm not convinced that the results would be brilliant. I would more strongly argue, and again, back on the immediate question of Russia's presidency of the Security Council, on the whole, my preference is for participate and frustrate. I agree with Dmytro Kuleba, who said that this is an absurd joke that Russia should be chairing the Security Council. But let's bring out that absurdity fully. Let's further expose Russia. Let's corner Russia, as Dmytro has said, but let's also expose Russia. of the absurdity of the narratives that they're bringing to the Security Council, and in that way, again, actually achieve some progressive degradation of the trust which rather too large portions of the global community still seem to place in Russia. That trust, I think Russians can, by their Security Council presidency, I think they can do their own work in demolishing some of that trust over the next month.
Be interesting to see if you're right, is something that these conversations might dig into in more detail. Foreign Minister, may I come back to you at this point and ask you one simple question? Does diplomacy have a chance to end this war?
Every war ends with an act of diplomacy. So, because there are people who sit down at the table and put their signatures on a paper. The question is, how do you reach that table? And I will be frank with you. Today, my job as foreign minister, and I literally spent the whole day today since morning until I showed up here, working on how to bring more weapons to Ukraine, how to make Ukrainian armed forces stronger. And the entire team of President Zelensky, be it diplomats or generals, is focused on this. And we are doing it. One could look at our effort from the perspective of the war, but there's also a diplomatic perspective for that, because we bring weapons to Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine reaches the table where peace will be negotiated in the strongest position possible after the successes on the battlefield. And this is what we are now focused on. While, of course, we have a clear vision of how peace can be achieved diplomatically. It's formulated in the peace formula proposed by President Zelensky last October at the G20 summit. We have a diplomatic proposal, but unfortunately, everything Russia does on the ground speaks for one very simple fact. It doesn't want diplomacy. It wants to continue fighting. And we are ready to defend our land. And if I may add just two quick points. One on the global south, what Ambassador said is important. I think the most intriguing question of diplomacy is how many countries do you need to win the war? And the number varies from one case to another. So the whole concept is not based on the premise that you need the entire world around you to win the war. You have to be very pragmatic in that and measure and apply your resources respectively. And on the United Nations and Russia's presence in the UN Security Council, of course, we are all rational. But I think this whole thing should be handled, Russia should be handled in accordance with the principle of salami. And the first slice of that salami is to expose a very simple fact. Russia's presence in the United Nations Security Council is the result of the largest diplomatic fraud of the 20th century. We should delegitimize Russia's presence in the United Nations Security Council first by exposing truths to everyone. And then the moment will come when next slices will be sliced. But this is our goal. It's very rational, it's very feasible. And the strongest part of it is that we are speaking the truth that was concealed and overlooked for decades.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one final thing and then come to general questions, and we're going to have lots and lots of questions. One final thing is about China's role and what your view is of the role that China seems to be playing.
I think China is at the moment when it's making up its mind on whether to continue with the current stance, as it has been the case for the last 14 months, or whether it has to step up its involvement in the conflict settlement process. And we believe that one of the key reasons of the last visit of President Xi to Russia was actually to kind of test the ground and to see whether Russia is ready to make any changes in its current behavior, and whether there are ways to make Russia change its behavior. So the outcome of that conversation, of course, we will not know it from the public statements, but the announcement by President Putin about the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus may be considered as an indicator that this conversation with the Chinese leader did not go very well for him, because the issue of nuclear security is of utmost importance for China. And when Putin made this statement about Belarus, it definitely something that does not correspond to Chinese policy on the nuclear in the nuclear sphere. Let's see. We'll see from real actions on the ground and moves in Moscow, Beijing, and other capitals on how the situation evolves. We are part of this exercise. There is no other country in the world that wants peace more than Ukrainians, than Ukraine, but we need real peace. We need just peace and lasting peace. We are not going for anything similar to Minsk, Normandy, or any format of that kind. Nothing that protracts the conflict. Nothing that gives Russia more space and time to better prepare for another wave of invasion. We need to win this war, and that's what we are working on.
Thank you. Let's come to questions. We have questions here. We have questions from people with the Foreign Minister. We have many, many questions online, a whole stream of them. Let's start in the room here. Let's go in the middle here. And I'm going to take them in two at a time, because we have a lot. Please, could you say your name?
Yes, thank you. My name is Yasune Kano, a visiting fellow at Chatham House from Japan. Thank you, Mr. Kuleba, for your remark. My question is about how you present or sell the proposal about the special tribunal. I mean, are you presenting the special tribunal as just one-off and unique case for the Russian Federation? Or are you presenting that to a rather more general example or principle for the future, including what happens in future in Asia or Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take a second one. Okay, over here.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you, Minister. Can I, James Nixie, Chatham House. Can I turn to other multilateral organizations, please, involved in security, the OSCE in particular, and NATO? How do you feel they have performed in this war? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Case for the special tribunal and how other institutions, NATO and OSCE, among others, have performed. Thank you.
We see special tribunal as a special institution, ad hoc institution for the case of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But if history of international relations and international law teaches us anything, it's that ad hoc precedents usually kind of may transform into a practice. That depends on how the world will evolve and how this specific ad hoc case will be interpreted in a broader context. But as of now, we are not looking at anything we are looking only at our own case, and we want people to be focused on that case for obvious reasons. Speaking about multilateral institutions, it's always tempting to blame multilateralism for everything. That's the safest way to blame anyone in diplomacy. It's to blame an international organization. It's not always fair. Multilateralism works on many accounts, but it's true, it fails on the issue of security, the most important one. And if there is any war in the world, it means that multilateralism failed again. And the war against Ukraine is just one big, obvious example of that. But there are many other conflicts in the world too. I think when it comes specifically to the EU and NATO, I think EU performed much better than it itself expected to perform. In the first year of the aggression, they begin to face some difficulties now, but the latest decision on the establishment of the mechanism that will allow procurement and production of 1 million artillery shells for Ukraine speaks for the fact that they're still capable of making unprecedented and big decisions. The next big test for the EU will be, of course, the decision to open accession talks with Ukraine in 2023. And we are all Ukrainians, Ukraine and the EU are working on making it happen. But my general, I can have hundreds of complaints, but because, you know, we are fighting a war and nothing is enough until you win the war. But in general, the EU has done much better than we expected. On NATO, there was a lot of frustration with NATO, with the way NATO responded in the very beginning of the war. And that frustration was very legitimate and well-grounded. NATO started to kind of win back slowly, and Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg should be credited for making it happen. But on the issue of Ukraine's integration into NATO, the alliance is still lagging far behind the European Union. That would be a fair assessment of the situation. And since I'm going to see both EU and NATO officials within a couple of days, I would like to make a disclaimer that they do not cancel the meetings for what I said about NATO.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two more and then also come to Simon Smith on these. Just picking up, following this point about Europe, I'm going to pick up two online. One from Richard Wright saying Ukraine is a candidate country to join the EU and a report on its readiness to begin accession negotiations is due in the autumn. What is Ukraine's timetable to join the EU? And does Ukraine believe there is enough political seriousness within the EU to push for its speedy accession? And then the second one from Stephen Erlanger, back on China. Do you believe China is being sincere in its desire to facilitate a peace, or is it just doing Russia's work? Is there any update on a President Xi call with President Zelensky or Wang Yi with you? These two, and then I'm going to come to Simon, and Simon, throw one more at you as well.
Let me pick it up where you left it. Sincerity is a very tricky notion in diplomacy. Okay, so
that is one of the best quotes in Chatham House this year, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, when you are fighting, what the war allows diplomats to do, diplomats of the fighting country, is to be far more sincere than others, and we are very honest and sincere in what we are saying and doing, because we know that the truth is on our side. But I'm not judging other countries by their kind of level of sincerity. We judge them by their understanding of what is at core of this conflict for them, and how to find a way to motivate them to behave in the way that benefits us and international law and order, or how to prevent them from behaving in the opposite way. And we built our dialogue with China and other countries based on that premise. On the EU, I mentioned it already, we have to open our goal is to open accession talks in 2023. I'm not going to name you a year, to give you a year when Ukraine will will become full member. I will only say that this is going to happen. Second, this is going to happen much sooner than many expect. And third, all of this is going to happen if the European Union does not come up with any artificial kind of new conditions, demands, or procedures to slow that process down. Ukraine has proved that it's ready to do its homework much faster than anyone expects. But what is really funny about this, about the European integration of Ukraine, is that for 20 years, it began in late 90s, and for 20 years, the European Union was saying to Ukraine, you have to reform yourself, and we will decide then whether you will become a member. That was kind of the premise. Now, tables turned in 2022 when Ukraine was granted the candidacy status. What we're hearing now is that the European Union has to reform itself for Ukraine to become a member of the EU. So while reforms was an issue in the first 20 years of Ukraine's EU integration, we will not allow, we will do our best, and we call on the European Union not to make reforms of the European Union an excuse for delaying Ukraine's accession to the Union.
Okay, and then we had China. Sorry.
I answered on China in the beginning.
We've covered the China. Yeah, then Simon. And I want to also stir into that the one from Monica Ingber of the would delegitimizing Russia's role on the Security Council call into question the legitimacy of the other permanent members?
Just to take that one first, I think that there's always been part of this reluctance to say don't mess with the Security Council because there are 45 different ideas about how to reform the UN, probably more, and just as many ideas about how to reform the Security Council. But over the years, nobody has really agreed. There's been no consensus on which idea works best and so on. So it's very easy to say, if you start unraveling one bit of it, then the rest of it will unravel very quickly. Personally, I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case, but it will be quite a serious retardant factor to what sound like good, big ideas to say, this isn't working, let's change it.
Thank you. Let's come back into the hall here. One here, in the white jacket.
Thanks a lot. Nina Kuriata, Tortoise Media. I've got a question for both Dmytro and Simon. My question is, there are voices, even in the West, saying that, okay, let's probably feed Putin with a part of Ukraine and he will come down and we will make business as usual with Russia as we did for ages. But at the same time, Putin's agenda is Ukraine is not the strategic enemy for Russia. Ukraine is one of the strategic goals to restore the Soviet Union, but the strategic enemy is the West. And my question is, does the West realize that? Because Putin sells the idea of this war to his population, saying that they are confronting US, NATO, and collective West. To which extent does the collective West understand that there's no friendship with Russia under no circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you. And over here, the red jacket.
Thank you. Maria Zolkina, research fellow at the London School of Economics and head of regional security at Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. I have a question to dear Minister. Can you please elaborate a little bit on the latest, newest attempt of Russia to blackmail again with the nuclear weapons deployment in Belarus? Do we assess the risk that Russia might use that kind of deployment on occupied Ukrainian territories, namely in Crimea, to prevent Ukraine from the occupation of all our territories?
Thank you for that. And I just mentioned the question from Tariq Tahir from The Sun does the minister think Russia could still use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and what should be the West's response to any such threats to use them? Thank you.
I forgot the first question.
The first question was, does the West understand the way... Oops,
yes,
we had lost the link. You can still hear us?
It's definitely, this understanding is definitely growing, and it has grown dramatically after 24th of February 2022. And the longer it takes, the stronger this understanding gets. The concept of concessions to Putin has two obvious problems. First, we should never forget that between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine and its partners did more, or had done more than they could, to find a diplomatic compromise with Russia. And where did it take us to? To the large-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. So first, the strategy of let's give something to Putin in order for him to, as the lady said, to feel fed up and pacified, failed. This strategy failed, and it's going to fail again if anyone decides to resort to it again. And the second purely rational problem with this concept is that even if you decide to entertain that idea, the question is how much you should give to Putin for him to feel fed up. Where does that line go? And this is why Ukraine, in principle, rejects both ideas of anything similar to Minsk agreements that draw another separation line. And second, the idea that something that any single square kilometer of Ukrainian land that is currently occupied by Russia can stay with Russia. No, it cannot. We are not claiming anything more than what belongs to us, according to international law. On the nuclear issue, I think I briefly spoke about Belarus. I think we should. But when it comes to the issue of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia, I think what we should always remember are two things. First, Russia is using the nuclear argument to sow fear and to press others into concessions. So do not, help them to do that one way or another. And second, the nuclear deterrence strategy of the West against the Soviet Union proved to be pretty successful. So why do you think that you can be less successful this time? I think the chances are very big that the threat of using the nuclear weapons will remain just a bargaining chip and not a reality. And nothing should stop us from doing the right thing, which is restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders.
Thank you for that. We've had a message. The Minister kindly can go on a few minutes past the top of the hour, but only a few minutes. Simon, do you want to come back on this? And I'm going to take some more here. And also want to know if there's any questions from the hall with the Foreign Minister. Simon.
Just to add a comment on this question about Crimea, and is Crimea somehow different or special? I mean, I think you're right. The questioner was right to say that yes, to a certain extent, in the sort of in the sort of Euro-Atlantic community, I felt at the time of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, that there were a lot of people who thought, yeah, somehow Crimea is different, and a lot of people very quick to put Crimea into the sort of bargaining chip box. That's going to be the sort of key, because we think the Ukrainians perhaps don't really care as much about Crimea as other bits of Ukraine. That idea was around. My sense is that, just as the Minister has said, this idea has radically diminished. And I think one of the reasons is because people are looking more clear-sightedly at the implications. If you tried to design a map of the region that said Crimea or parts of it, or some sort of compromise was made, but some of it meant that Russia's footprint was still there, then you have to start asking yourself some pretty serious questions about the implication that has for your security, whether you're in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, and you have to start asking what opportunities it gives to the invader, the aggressor, to just do the whole thing again, or actually, as the Minister has just said, to give them time to think, to give them room to think, and to say, right, we are now, on the basis of our occupation of Crimea, we are much better placed to make the third invasion of Ukraine a great success. And I think that realization has really taken root in much wider parts of the Euro-Atlantic community than was the case 8 years ago.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take, there's one or two on the aisle here, one here, and then one in front. Sorry, first behind and then in front.
Deli Ogun, Fatherland Group, Nigeria. On the issue of the Global South, is it that the argument has failed, or is it that the Global South have failed to listen? And is there new thinking that is going on in terms of persuading the Global South to shift its position?
Thank you very much. And right in front of you.
Thank you very much, Carlo Tolle, Chatham House. Thank you, Minister. In your initial remarks, you rightly said that we should not repeat Minsk and Normandia format, given where we are now. In any prospective diplomatic engagement with Russia, what security guarantees and guarantors would you be insisting on? And separately, what would you like NATO to do in Black Sea now? What more NATO should do in Black Sea now?
Thank you. Global South, the argument, and NATO. Minister.
Yeah, on the Global South, when I was answering when I was making my remarks about the Global South, I deliberately used the word talk, not persuade. You know, we are not in a kindergarten where you have to persuade someone in a very simple thing, that it's bad for one country to attack another country. Everyone is smart. African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, they all understand perfectly what is happening. You don't have to persuade them. You have to understand why did they take a certain stance, perfectly understanding what is going on. Why do they pretend that it's not what it is? And work with those arguments and talk to them. And what I learned from my conversations with Asian, African, Latin American countries is that you don't have to persuade them, you have to talk with them on equal. And this is the most crucial thing, to take them as equal partners who want to be heard, and this should be an equal conversation. The moment they feel that you are trying to push on them and persuade them in something, they actually step back, and it gets more difficult. But the conversation has to continue, and countries, they take their stance because for various reasons. Some want to make money on this war, which is true. There are such countries. Others have strategic projects with Russia that they don't want to lose. That's also true. Someone else benefits from the presence of Russia's mercenaries in their territories. Others belong to political groups with Russia on board. Every country is different. And frankly speaking, I don't like the notion of global south, because it puts everyone on the equal footing and presents the whole situation as a standoff between the North and the South, which is not the case. Every country is special. Every country should be treated on its own merits. And there are very different countries in every region of the world when it comes to the way they interpret this war and the support they provide. Gosh, sorry, I'm so. And the second question
on NATO and the
security
of NATO.
guarantees.
Yeah. Thank you.
The best security guarantee, not for Ukraine, but for the Euro-Atlantic area as a whole, is Ukraine's full membership in the EU and NATO. There is no alternative to it, and anyone writing a PhD thesis on that matter should drop it, because it just doesn't make sense. The only strategic response is Ukraine's membership in both EU and NATO. The question is what happens between now and the moment when Ukraine becomes member of both institutions. And the answer to that is the document called Kyiv Security Compact, which has a list of things that countries can provide Ukraine with as security guarantees. To cut long story short, in a nutshell, this document is about everything but what Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is about.
We're coming right to the end. I'm just going to ask you, because there are a lot of questions online on one particular aspect of the China point, which is what the Chinese response has been, again over this point, what the Chinese response has been to President Zelensky's offer of a phone call, and what President Zelensky would like to say to President Xi.
Well, I think we will keep it for the conversation, what President Zelensky wants to say to President Xi. The official response of Beijing to our requests for a call and for the invitation to come, for President Xi to come to Ukraine, is that they're carefully examining the request.
Thank you very much indeed. Simon, your last thoughts, briefly, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Just to say that, again, I think the Minister is absolutely right that whatever happens in terms of the speed with which Ukraine moves closer to the EU, to NATO, and eventually joins, there is going to be a period between now and then, and I think that the essential thing to do is to focus on the practicalities. What, in practical, concrete terms, is guaranteeing Ukraine's security for the next few years? Because that's also guaranteeing the wider security of the region. It's also guaranteeing global security. And that is a question we need to address, whatever happens in the progress and the speed of the relationship between Ukraine and NATO and the European Union. What are the guarantees in place? What is the military support? What is the extent to which other countries in support of Ukraine have committed their resources on a permanent basis, I would say? Those are going to be the vital questions which we need to be working on right now, however long it takes, or however speedy the process of accession may be.
Thank you for that. We are going to have to stop now. Foreign Minister, thank you very, very much for joining us. Everyone in the hall in Kyiv, thank you for sending in questions from here. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you here in the hall. Foreign Minister, again, thank you.